5 books I'll sell my soul to read again for the very first time. The books that I'm gonna talk about in this video are literally the books I would recommend to someone if they said what books I should read before I die. And I'll truly give them these recommendations. I truly believe everyone should read these 5 books. If you're human, read this book. That's it. There is no other criteria. If you're human, living in a society, interact with other humans, you get sad, happy, lonely, angry, it's perfect. Read these 5 books. There is philosophy books, fictional, historical fiction. It's a mixed bunch out here. So let's start. First book, surprise, surprise. Well, not surprised. If you follow me, you know how much I love Fyodor Dostoevsky. So first book is Crime and Punishment. One of the best books of 19th century. I'm no scholar, but it just is. Okay? If you haven't read it, I advise reading it. If you have read it, can't remember it, go back to it. Honestly, it made sense when I read it the second time. I enjoyed it the second time more. I read it because the first time I read it, I was in school and my English just wasn't what it is now. It's a literature book, so you might find yourself, Googling some of the things. So don't worry about it. Literature books are supposed to be that way, especially when they're translated. As some of you know, this was originally written in Russian. Who am I kidding? Everyone knows who Dostoevsky is, so let's move on. This book centers on a student. It's called Raskolnikov. If I'm pronouncing it wrong, forgive me, it's a Russian name. Now this fella is quite poor. He's a very intelligent young boy. He's studying law and he wants to make himself great. He's not the most modest or humble of character, but he and his friends, they're very deep thinkers. They philosophize quite a lot on what Raskolnikov is focused on. Now, because he is poor and, begging one meal to next, he comes across and he actually uses an old lady who's a pawnbroker. He notices about this woman that she's a horrible person. She's cunning and she's got this sort of she's got this mentally disabled relative, but this old pawnbroker abuses her and is horrible to this mentally ill relative and doesn't give her anything. He calls her a cockroach, a parasite on a society. Like, people get into hard times and need to get money, so they lend things to her and she obviously gets her money back on interest. So he begins to think, would it be correct if you kill this woman, took her money and gave it to the poor or gave it to the society or even use it for himself to become able to become a great lawyer and then be able to shape and mold the society for the benefit of it all? And is it possible for somebody to legitimately overstep the moral boundaries of society and commit murder if it is for the benefit of majority? So that's the underpinning idea. It's no giveaway, it's no spoiler. He does kill this woman in this book. The book is 100 years old. You have had enough time to read it, so don't come at me with the review without spoilers. Come on, it's a classic. And the scene when he kills, it's unflinching. It really makes you feel everything our character feels afterwards, how it affects him, and that's the whole book of it. Once he kills him, then what goes inside his mind, the logic and the reasoning, that's the whole book. It seems to trouble his conscience on one hand, but logically he feels unrepentant because this woman wasn't a great person. He feels like he did it to help the society. And then his life crosses some other characters. Katrina is there. Katrina used to be from a quite well-to-do family, but marrying a drunk gambling man has led her into poverty. Because of that, the daughter Sophia has to sell herself into prostitution to feed her little brothers and sisters and pay rent. And our lead character Raskolnikov watching all of this, but it contracts his way of thinking. It's drastically different from Sophia, who is very much devout Christian, and yet here she is breaking a Christian law, fornication, because she's a prostitute, but she's doing it for the good of others and she's sacrificing herself. And he senses like a kind of a contrast. Raskolnikov, who is sacrificing someone else for the benefit of others, and Sophia does it the other way around. And there are this other characters in the story. As the story progresses, one friend who is quite balanced character, I loved reading about him. So he doesn't know our lead character has murdered someone, no one does, but he's trying to help him work his way through the mental turmoil our character is going through. And then you get into this new character, police inspector, who's on to this lead character. He suspects him of murder, of course, but he can't tie him down to it. But he talks so agreeably to Raskolnikov's, and it becomes this unbearable conscious issue because Raskolnikov's isn't caught, at least not straight away. Or in fact, does he ever get caught at all? That's the thing, you're always waiting for the entire book and for him to be caught. And Raskolnikov knows the cop knows, and he's guilty, but he can't prove it. And Raskolnikov's got to keep up the facade of being innocent and constantly being on that, lookout for things that could give him away. So it's constant, oh my god, what's going to happen, right? It is interesting how the psychology affects him, and this is what this book really does. It's somewhat psychological, and yet it's not invasive narrative. I think the author Dostoevsky was a psychologist, if I'm not wrong. It's very, very powerful piece of work. Like I say, there are a lot of other characters in this book. His sister and his mother are not doing very well financially, so there is a bit of that issue as well. The way the story actually ends is unbelievable, but it's crowd splitter actually, because Dostoevsky wrote an epilogue afterward, which some people like and others, me, not so much. Now I'm going to talk to you about why I think you should read it. It will challenge you. This book is not just a story, and none of the books on this list are actually. This book is a mind grinder. It wants you to engage, put your mind and morals to work out rights and wrongs, blacks and whites. Dostoevsky himself goes into this book not with a very clear ideology, not with a clear conception or settled opinion of what he thinks. He is testing out an idea, and that idea is sort of like nihilistic attitude. It's very materialistic, nihilistic, but he compares it. War and Peace. War and Peace is long book for sure. It's a monster. Before I read this, I think of the review said reading a book like this is similar to entering a relationship, and it requires a lot of commitment. And I was like, yeah, bring it on. And boy, was I wrong. It has some deepest, most realistic characters you'll find anywhere. I mean, if big books intimates you, this is not for you. 1200-page epic featuring love stories and battlefields and bankruptcies and firing squads. War and Peace opens on an evening of war between France and Russia, but aristocrats in the party talking about things like money, sex, death, rich people. But actually, this first scene is indicative of the way this book bounces between political and personal scenes. It wanders a lot back and forth, but get this, there is no main characters in this book, in War and Peace. Instead, you'll find this vast interlocking web of relationship. Will this helpless and illegitimate son of Count marry a beautiful but conniving princess? Will this only friend survive the battlefield of Austria? Things like that. Then there is Napoleon appears several times. Even one of the Tolstoy's ancestor plays background part. Tolstoy plays with this, particular questions a lot. Why do wars start? Do nations rise and fall on the action of so-called great men like Napoleon? Or are there larger cultural and economical forces at play? Let me keep it short. This book is pretty long itself. This is a grand interrogation into a world, history, culture, philosophy, psychology, and the human response to war. I obviously cannot give you the entire story, but you have basics. I am far from being an expert on Nietzsche, so I'm a little afraid to speak about this book. It's more of a philosophical book, so people have very strong take on the things that are in this book. But Nietzsche discusses how the concept of liberal democracy will not work because it depends on good and bad religious moral views. Nietzsche did break the conventional view of liberal democracy of both focusing on the individual, but here the desire to achieve power, a will to power plays an important role. Okay, hear this. Many propositions and theses and claims made by philosophers can be manifestation of the personal characteristics of those philosophers, like habits and presumptions of those philosophers themselves. And that was very interesting take, but his take on free spirit is also very interesting. As an alternative to the standard mode of philosophizing, consider a different species of thinker who are not afraid of asking the forbidden question and questioning unspoken assumptions like what is religion and how religion becomes such a strong tool and why is it so powerful. Really mind-bending questions. You go a little bit deep into it, but you basically everything is kind of up to you and how to grab the things he's talking about. Other interesting questions are focused on natural history of morals and how morality and moral rules came. What is the alternative to the current moral system? What type of people flourish under which moralities? And what is good and what is evil? How much evil is evil? Then what is noble? How different classes of people have different meaning for good and bad, and how this different leads to different moralities, the conditions for being noble. Finally, the possibility for noble type of a person to exist in the modern climate. This book is still very much thought-provoking, and I think everyone should read it. You don't have to like everything in this book to like this book, and that's how I feel about this book. Definitely some of the things I don't agree with morally, but you should read it. Great author of his time, great thinker of his time, and definitely deserves a read. The Idiot, Dostoevsky. Simply excellent. Crime and Punishment is my favorite book by Dostoevsky, but this has a special place. This book was written in, I think, mid 1800s, and it's a clear reflection of political and moral ideology at the time. Yet you will find it, relevant and thought-provoking even nearly 200 years later. It uses a lot of different words. I hated that part, but also if you can get Penguin updated version, I think it has more accessible language. Despite the hard words in this copy, the general understanding will find its way to you despite it being translated version. The way Dostoevsky writes takes you into this mind of individual characters and practically feeling their insanity as your own. This book has a badass female character too. I don't really like how he writes women in general, but in this book I have to say he's made this female love interest really strong, go-getter kind of woman. I'm not saying she's a good woman, but I like that Dostoevsky didn't always think of woman as this weakling. It's a love triangle story, but don't leave yet. Nothing like Bollywood. It has many interesting characters. This book always leaves you with, cliffhangers at the end of each chapter. I plan to put this book down so many times, but then I was convinced to continue reading by some dramatic revelation on the last page of the chapter. It took me a while to get through this book, but I found it to be very comforting read. Do not rush this book. You will definitely feel the desperation of the characters, the anger, the disappointment, and like many other Dostoevsky books, this too has, drastic things like murder in it. It's not love story per se, but you cannot deny it either. Like there is some aspect of it. Like it's definitely about individual and their morals and how as a reader keep changing your mind about characters in this book. It does have sad ending though. I stand with the people who say that Dostoevsky is one of the most excellent writer to have ever lived. Yeah, I'm one of those people, fan. So I think you should read it. 100 Years of Solitude. First thing, it was written by Gabriel García. It's in the genre called magical realism, which is, to be honest, I kind of hate calling it because it gives people this wrong idea. This is a very much a realistic story. Magical realism is basically where the writer throws in some weirdness into everyday story, and if it's done correctly, like in this book, you will barely even notice it. I mean, you will often be doing double takes, like, did that really just happen? Is he not there? Is he the ghost? Things like that. It is written about in such a matter of fact, like everyday life kind of way, that you often barely even notice that the magical element are even there. It's totally not the focus of the story at all, and that is a sign of magical realism done really well. That's this book. It's more like realism with some magical element in the background. If you like this genre and maybe read 100 years Solitude already, there is this another writer, Haruki Murakami, who does magical realism also really, really well. A Japanese writer, in particular, Kafka on the Shore was a good read for me. Norwegian Wood was creepy, perverted. I don't know, maybe I just don't like the author in real life, so I kind of made myself doubt if I really enjoyed the book or not. Some people will just disappoint you. Most authors that are great authors are terrible human beings, so sadly, but I would still say Kafka on the Shore is a good read. But anyway, back to this book. Let's move on to the plot a bit. The story is basically about this family. It tells the story of their family over 100 years, hence the name. So starting the generation to generation to generation, it's largely set within the family home, right? It's almost like this whole family is cursed in a way, with this affliction of solitude and being prone to feeling solitary and lonely and ending their lives alone. And in a way, it is quite sad, but it's also very uplifting kind of tale. Also, the family has tendency to name everybody the same, which can add some confusion. Plus, Spanish names are confusing to me, but my version of this book has this family tree way. So this helps. If your book doesn't have it, you can easily find family tree of this book on Google, I'm sure. So while reading, I usually go back and check if I get confused with the name. So if you're reading this for the very first time, I kind of recommend to just Google family tree. It's not really gonna spoil anything, but Google a family tree just to have by your side for as you're reading, because it can be kind of hard to keep track of who is who. The reason I really love this book is because this book brings in element of real life events that went on Colombia's past and the wars between liberals and conservatives. But also there is this moment in this book that mirrors a really awful massacre that happened from the United Fruit Company. It's on the Google if you want to research. This is where the mastery of magical realism comes into play, because he's not only telling a story in factual everyday terms, he's also pulling from real life and then using this magic in background to just enhance the story. So there is some incest in it. It gets weird for but pull through it. I wouldn't describe it as an easy read, and also it jumps around. The timeline is kind of back and forth. This book led the author to winning Nobel Prize for Literature. If that doesn't tell you something, then I don't know what. You should read it. So that's it for today. I will see you tomorrow. Subscribe and like and comment down your favorite book or book that you want me to read. And I'm also planning on making videos on my non-fictional books, like self-improvement books that I've been reading from past 10 years. I have a huge collection in that, so I'm going to make more videos on that as well. And for now, goodbye.